Welcome back to the Cornelius Seed podcast. We've got another late season update. So now picture this with me. Imagine it's late in August or early September, like we're in right now. And you're walking your cornfields. You pull back that husk and you find white, pink, or green, really just a variety of mold creeping across those kernels. Your heart sinks, and you start wondering, is this going to be what does me in, right? It's not the southern rust or the tar spot. Is it this mold? Or is the mycotoxin a threat for my livestock? This is going to be one of the questions that we dive into today, and a little bit more. We're going to get a season update from across the country. I'm joined by our lead agronomist, Craig Allaman, who has been putting on some miles on his truck. So we've got a good episode for you here. So welcome, Craig. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm glad to be back home and rested up a little bit. Early part of the week was busy.
It's been kind of interesting this season. Every season's interesting on how it progresses and what our next episode is. Right, our team, our marketing person likes to have a nice schedule of what we're going to talk about, but more often than not, Mother Nature or those crops or those fields kind of tell us what we need to talk about. And so, this particular case right here, you had Mike Preby up in, would you say, north central Iowa.
Yeah.
Kind of ring the alarm and say, hey, our guys are getting a little bit concerned up here, and we should get an update out there. So, tell us, what are you seeing?
Yeah. And Mike was wondering about ear molds and, just kind of a refresher on identifying and, what we need to worry about as far as mycotoxins, which can come along with ear molds. It doesn't necessarily, even if you have it, and some of them don't produce a mycotoxin, but we worry about those. They can affect livestock, which that's most of what our corn and soybeans are going to go to is food for our livestock. So we do want to make sure that we're on top of that if conditions are good for a certain ear mold, and make sure we know which ones possibly have a mycotoxin associated with them. And very normal thing. We'll have ear molds every year to some extent. And it's based on the kind of weather, so we can pretty much predict, on at least a good percentage of them, what we might see. And if you think about this year, because ear molds most of the time are going to set in at the silking time frame, some afterwards, with where they'll set in where we've had insect damage, so maybe earworm feeding on the tip, or birds. A lot of times you see these blackbirds start flying in the fall. They'll come along there and they'll land on the end of the ear, and they'll just rake the end of that ear open so they can get to some of the kernels when they're still in kind of a milkier type stage. So they've been doing that for a while here. And then that leaves an opening for some of these ear molds to get into. Now, in my travels this week, I did start seeing them. I for sure saw some Trichoderma, which is really easy to identify because it's really the only one that, when that mold gets in there, some of those kernels will sprout right on the ear. So you'll see just, like a little sprout coming out of the kernel, like you would see if we planted it underneath the soil surface. So that one's pretty easy to identify. But as we look at the conditions this year, Fusarium is probably the one that jumps out because Fusarium likes warm conditions during silking, which we had really, really warm conditions during silking, and then wet conditions later on during grain fill, which we're in right now, the later grain fill period. And we've continued to have rain in most areas. Some areas it's shut off now. But it doesn't have to be rain. It could be just heavy dews and fogs and things like that, which we have been getting now, that we kind of worry about bringing our tar spot on. So yeah, and you've got it, I think, popped up there. People be able to see it there, and you can see I've highlighted in yellow, and I've just made a quick ID guide so the guys can have it with them when they're out there looking at these things. But the ones I've highlighted in yellow, I think, are the conditions that we've had this year. If you look over here at Gibberella, which that one's kind of easy too, because it's the one that's going to have a pinkish hue to that mold that's on the ear tips there. But with Gibberella, cool and wet conditions during silking, which we didn't have this year. So we shouldn't see a lot of that, although we could. You don't want to let anything out there, but um, aspergillus is hot and dry during the late silking, which is also on the screen there. So we didn't really have hot dry. We really had hot and wet. So I wouldn't expect to see a lot of that. I mentioned trichoderma, which is on the other sheet there. Um, Damaged kernels on the ear tips from insects or birds. So we have that every year. You could have earworm damage. You could have western bean cutworm damage, which we've had both. You could have fall armyworm. So we've had that. But you're always going to have those birds come in there too and rake back some husk. And you can see the husk on the tip of the ear are raked back or just shredded when the birds have been in there. You're like, what in the world happened here? And it was birds that did that. Um, but the other thing alarming this year too, that's definitely different and definitely a factor of the year is, with these really good growing conditions we've had, I've seen a fair amount of ears, and it's dependent on hybrid a lot of times, but a fair amount of ears that have outgrown their husks. So, maybe this husk cover was set up early in the season, and we just had such good conditions that the ears got longer than the plant expected them to, and just kind of grew out the end of those husks. So we see that a little bit every year, and different hybrids have different ratings on how good their husk cover is. Some go way out past the tip each time, and some almost always never, just barely cover it maybe. So when they start flaring open, we see the end of that ear. But this year I'm seeing an inch or two of ears. It's not uncommon to see on some hybrids just sticking out the end of the husk, and that just makes it open and susceptible to get more of these molds moved in, especially the ones that maybe move in after silking. So we could see some of that. Penicillium ear rot is another one. I think you've got that on that sheet there, but wet human conditions after grain fill. So, that's maybe really coming up here. So if we continue to be wet in places like that, we could potentially see penicillium. I mentioned trichoderma already, and we've got conditions for that. The diplodia is probably, and you can see that here on the screen, that's probably our most common year in and year out. But wet during silking, which we had, but it likes more moderate temperatures. So I wouldn't think we'd see a ton of that. This is the one that if you're out there this time of the year, you're going along and your husks are still green, and then every now and again you see one that's the husks are completely dead on it. Likely that is diplodia. That's a sign of that. And when you shuck those husks back, starting usually at the butt of the ear, you have that white mold there between the ears. It doesn't have a mycotoxin, but it is, typically does make that grain pretty light. So we definitely don't like to see it. And again, typically that's one of the more prominent ones that we see. The nigrospora ear rot there, we don't see it as often, but potentially this year because of those tips that are sticking out, I think we could see maybe more of this one than normal. And this is the one where you take that ear off and you can like push in the middle of the ear on the kernels, and they like sink in because that cob is as you can see in the picture, if you bust it open, that cob is affected as well. It's got a gray fungal growth on there. Highly likely when you run the combine through, this cob busts up a lot more than normal and maybe gives us more cob in the grain sample as well. So that's kind of 20,000 foot of the main ones that we usually look at. And again, if you're looking at this, you'll have this guide. But if you want to go on to the Crop Protection Network, has I think a pretty good overview of these diseases. So if you just search corn ear rots, it'll pop up a link to the Crop Protection Network.
Yeah.
One of the most important thing is how do we handle this grain? Okay, if we do identify that we've got these diseases out here, and we know that we could potentially have these mycotoxins, and each of them have a different. There's vomitoxin, there's fumonisins, there's just a whole bunch of different toxins, but they're all a form of mycotoxins. Each one of them can be a little more dangerous to different types of animals, types of livestock, whether it's swine or horses or cattle or whatever. But we do want to make sure that we're aware of it, find it in the field, identify it, and then that we handle it correctly. And by that, it's pretty simple. You want to harvest it wetter than maybe you normally would. So really 20 to 25% moisture when you combine it out of the field. And then we want to get it dried down before you put it in the bin, pretty rapidly. Get it down to, we'd like to see it down to 13%, which, long-term storage, we generally 14% is the standard there. 15% is number two yellow corn, but we'd really like to take it down a little drier if we've got these fungal diseases in there. And then as soon as it cools off enough in November or whenever that may be, get the fans going and cool that down to 30 degrees Fahrenheit for your long-term storage. And then we only want to keep it stored during the cold months. So, it starts warming up in March or whenever that may be, we need to really get it out of the bin and get it shipped. So those are kind of just your standard approaches to how you would handle that grain.
So just to we pulled up the images of the common ones that you could be seeing out there, and you've pretty much established that we're set up for it. The weather has been there to foster it. You made a comment earlier about how it's not uncommon to have an inch or two of the ear kind of picking out of the husk there towards the end. And did I hear you correctly that you're even seeing it a little bit more this year?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a real common thing. Some hybrids will do that a little bit more than others, but it's normally, if we see that, it's very minor. But this year, I'm definitely noticing more of that, and that's not surprising. We had greenhouse growing conditions since second week in June, that lasted clear through middle of August at least, and so our ear has just outgrown our husks, and a positive thing. I mean, it's just a factor of good growth. And this,
Okay, and that's kind of where I was going with it. Is my simple little IT mind. It sounds like, man, it sounds like there's probably a good crop brewing,
yep,
and in a way it is, and you narrow it down to kind of the green growing in a greenhouse, and you
yep.
are right. We've definitely been stacked up for that.
But you think about it. I mean,
Um,
we talked about insect, feeding in the tip of the ears and birds and everything. So if it the what when that happens, that's when these diseases get in there, um, and the husks then act as protection on the kernels. So if the end of the ear grows out of the husk, there's no protection for that part of the ear that's sticking out. So even weak diseases like a nigrospora or something like that, that are fairly weak diseases to the ear are going to be able to get on those kernels pretty easily. So we're going to see some ear molds on the tips of those ears that are out of the husk.
okay, so if I follow correctly too, is in terms of what can I do about it. It sounds like it's just paying attention to your harvest plan, right? If you're scouting and you feel like it's prevalent and it's out there more than you'd like, harvest
Yeah,
earlier,
there's
or
there's nothing we're going to do now that it's here. So just put it on your list. I mean, we've talked to people many years now about getting out there and scouting all your fields ahead of harvest so you can see if you have a standability issue, if you have a field where you got stock issues or root lodging or whatever. So just put this in there as part of that walk through these fields. Is I'm going to also look for ear molds, and guys likely are already doing that, but we might see a few more this year the way it looks. And so identify what you have and which fields have it, and then what your harvest plan is with those fields.
okay, no, that's good, and we'll remind folks. We've got the push pinch pull pinch push pull campaign there when you're determining your harvest priority. So economic losses. Is there an impact to test weight? Are we looking at bushels? Is there something? Are we bringing attention to this just because we're seeing it? We want to be mindful of our harvest and storage plan, or is there other yield implicators?
There could be some yield issues. I mean, we talked about the Diplodia earlier, making the kernels light, and some of these other ones can. I think Trichoderma probably will make those kernels a little lighter too. But averaged across the whole field, you're not likely to see anything. It's not when we have this. It's not every plant. It's just scattered plants here and there, scattered ears here and there. So I wouldn't
Okay.
look for it to be unless it's really severe for some odd reason for it to be a situation where you're going to get docked on your test weight or anything.
Okay. Now, the other follow up that we had on that was the mycotoxin. We mentioned that a couple times. For those of us, me, who might not be as familiar with the impact to livestock that is, why do we care about that?
Well, they can act as a poison to the livestock. Depending on what the mycotoxin is and how much of it that the animal would ingest and so forth. But I mean, you can have issues with their liver, heart, a lot of different things. Just make them sick, not gain well, and so forth. So, um, that's why we like to get it killed and in our storage handling and we can, if we're aware of it, we can blend it off to a livestock that's not affected by that. Mycotoxin is one thing that we would do, or use it in ethanol or something like that, where that's not an issue.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, because it sounds like um, you've got some options as to what you can do with it. But if you're an operation that's growing just purely for feed, then it's probably going to matter a little bit more to you. And but you said it's not a whole field thing. So well, we've talked about what it is, who it impacts, even what you can do, right? Which is harvest early, focus on storage. Um, any management strategies for next year? Is this purely environmental, and it is what it is, and it'll always be?
No, we're where we can, we breed in some tolerance to some of these, and it's the conditions that are favorable to one disease that's kind of out of your hand, and it's going to be a different conditions each year. So I don't think there's a lot we can do as far as a management approach. I mean, I think maybe one or two of these diseases, good fertility. We're trying to do that anyway, so it's not anything extra. So, as far as extra things
Right.
that we're going to be able to do, no, I don't think so.
Um, is there something that, as you've been out there, that you're thinking, look, we probably should have put a little bit more focus on now, right? Or made a note, something consistent that you've seen that we could have prepared for better next year, whether it's not lining up a sprayer or anything out there that you can.
I, I, there's not a lot that jumps out at me because once again, whatever you prepare for what conditions we had in 2025, and we won't see that again ever. We could have some similar ones, but highly likely we'll see very different ones next year. I do think with the heavy, just kind of underscoring our recommendation with the heavy fungicide or the heavy fungal disease that we've seen. I still think a long residual fungicide at the R1 stage is really, really important. And, I have looked at fields that are still using the older products where you're only getting a couple of weeks. I was in a field where they sprayed the older products twice and really weren't doing the job that they needed to do. So I think these newer fungicides, even though they're a little more expensive, but gonna get us 30 to 45 days depending on what you're using. I think that approach that we have been recommending, I think, played out very well this year. We are going to get more tar spot. We're starting to get tar spot heavier. There's probably going to be another cycle or two of tar spot, but if we are clean of the other diseases, it's too little, too late for the tar, just like tar usually is. It really likes to make a big splash late in the season, but if there's no other diseases there with it, it just kind of it's just there, but doesn't really affect our yield. So I think continue to do that type of a program. Get your Revitex and your Veltimas and your Delaro Completes and those products with the SDHI. They're more expensive. I think they're well worth it at the R1 stage of corn.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, and something that sometimes I've taken for granted is that, given that we're a seed company only, and we've got no dog in the fight as it relates to what kind of a spray program or chemical program you're on. You're just sharing this purely on what you're seeing and what the data is showing you, and not particularly vouching for one product or another, right? It's just laying it out there, right, as you see it out there. Well, folks, you heard Craig, right? If you're out there and continue scouting, we're at that point where you're prioritizing your harvest plan. It seems like the season is continuing to progress faster than expected, or sooner. At least it seems that way in the seed corn world. Um, don't forget to check out the Crop Protection Network. Uh, amazing website with ton of resources and lots of good, easy to navigate. So I was just kind of clicking through it as you were talking, and yeah, really good stuff there. So we'll link that in the show notes.
Yep.
And
Well put together. Yep.
perfect. Well, until the next one, have a good one.
Thank you, Juan.
Thanks, Craig.